Previously, we went over how to incorporate or embed quotes into your own writing. So when should you quote versus summarize, paraphrase, or reference? You should quote when you are analyzing the author's style or voice, so you're looking at things like diction, which is word choice, tone, or sentence structure. You can also use a quote whenever the author's words are much better than what you could possibly say, and it helps to emphasize or prove your point. Here is an example of when it is appropriate to use a quote. When describing himself, Death says, "I'm all bluster. I am not violent. I am not malicious. I am a result." By revealing Death as all talk and no fearful action, the audience can relax and more openly accept Death as the narrator, for he is not the reason for someone's demise. He is the aftermath. Because it's important to notice the words that Zuzak is using, like bluster, violent, malicious, and result, it's okay to use a quote. It's also not very lengthy. And in my explanation, notice that I relate and refer to every part of this quote. So if you are not discussing everything in the quote, you can eliminate some things in the quote. Now let's move on to other forms of evidence other than direct quotes. So one example is a summary. So when is it appropriate to summarize? The most common time is whenever you're trying to focus on a large portion of the text. Let's say you're trying to cite multiple pages or multiple paragraphs. This is whenever you want to summarize or just point out the main idea. In persuasive writing or argumentative writing, you can also summarize whenever you are addressing a counter argument, meaning it's somebody else's opinion, and then you will refute it with your actual evidence. But that's for another time. Let's say I want to analyze how Himmel Street means heaven, but it's really not heavenly. So I found all this evidence. You can see that I have identified 5 different quotes. And instead of using all of these direct quotes, it's more important for your reader to be able to see that you can interpret the book and comprehend the book and analyze the book yourself. So you want to use your own words. So instead of using all of these quotes, I have summarized the main idea of all of them. Although Himmel Street translates to Heaven Street, the visual is anything but blissful, with low-income tiny houses and apartments stacked on top of each other, and a constant dingy atmosphere of dirty snow or rain, pavement, bare trees, and dark clouds. See how much more concise that is? Yet it still addresses the main idea and gets your point across. Notice too that it is still cited the same way that you would a direct quote, because these are not your own words. This does come from the text. You still need to cite, otherwise you are plagiarizing. Now this is just an example of the actual evidence, not further explaining it or going into greater detail. Another form of evidence is the paraphrase. Now a lot of people get confused with the difference between a paraphrase and a summary. A summary is usually a larger piece of text that you're just focusing on the main idea, or a paraphrase is typically a shorter part of the text and you are just changing it to your own words, getting in more details though. So a good time to paraphrase would be is whenever you can say it better than the author did. Okay, so the words that he uses really aren't that significant. You can also use it to support a point with a specific place in the text, to present an opposing view. Then you can use a direct quote to support your view. That's typically more for analytical writing as well, or argumentative writing. Or you can use an example that a character in the story uses, so you don't have to do the double quotations, the dialogue within a direct quote as well. To help you better understand when it's appropriate to use a paraphrase, let's look at this example. Let's say I found this piece of evidence. Whoever named Himmel Street certainly had a healthy sense of irony. Not that it was a living hell, it wasn't, but it sure as hell wasn't heaven either. I'm trying to make it not as repetitive and to show that I can demonstrate what Zuzak is trying to convey. So I'm going to put it into my own words and also add a little variety into my writing so it's not just quote after quote after quote. So here's an example. One would expect a street named after heaven to be paradise. However, Himmel Street is not. Even though it is not as bad as hell, life is not easy in this part of Mulking. Okay, and then you can go on after that, maybe to give specific examples of how life is not that easy, so that you could have more precise and specific evidence to support the point that you're trying to make. The last form of evidence I want to point out to you is a reference. So when is it appropriate to refer to something in the text? When you want to blend your own words with a short phrase from the text, so you're not using the entire sentence, just only the specific words, or whenever you want to provide some background context. Let's look at an example on the next slide. So here's my evidence. You can see that the quote is rather long. The roof was flat and there was a shallow basement for storage. It was supposedly not a basement of adequate depth. In 1939, this wasn't a problem. Later in 42 and 43, it was. When air raids started, they always needed to rush down the street to a better shelter. All right, so I have two examples of how you can refer to the text here. Again, it's cited just like the paraphrase, the summary, or the direct quote. So before World War II, and notice that that was never actually explicitly stated in the text. So this is why you can do a reference. 42 and 43, it's talking about the basement not being deep enough. It talks about air raids, so we know that it is referencing World War II. So before World War II, the Huberman's basement was satisfactory, but once World War II struck, it was considered too shallow and not safe. The other example is, because it did not have adequate depth, that's my short phrase, the Hubermans had to leave their home during the bombings of World War II. You can keep that in there because notice how in the original text it is italicized. So it's basically saying this is what like the Nazi party as they're going around, they're showing, hey, this is not safe, you need to go elsewhere. No matter what form of evidence you choose to use, make sure you follow this format. You have your introductory context, your evidence, and then your analysis. This will create better flow and organization. If you provide the analysis up front before your evidence, you're giving everything away, and then your argument is belittled because it becomes redundant. So make sure you provide that brief context so that the audience understands where you're going. You have your evidence, and then the analysis. Let's look at an example. One of Zuzak's themes is the beauty and ugliness within humanity. So this is my main point. For example, my transition. Rudy Steiner's dynamic and contradictory character is revealed when death flashes forward to Rudy being a giver of bread, not a stealer. So I have some of that background context, then I give my direct quote. And now I'm going to explain the significance of that and relate it to my point. Even though in both instances Rudy was poor and hungry, he learned to be kind and gracious to others who are suffering just as much, if not more, than he is. It's concise, it is direct, it is clear, and it relates to the main point that you are trying to prove. And I'm not focusing so much on what Zuzak is specifically saying. I'm only pointing out the important aspects of the text, right? Giver of bread, not a stealer, to show that contradiction between ugliness and beauty and how humanity can be both.